Mr Dawson.
Thank you, Lady. In my odyssey through the COVID pandemic in Scotland, I had got, I think, to the end of 2020.
You had.
So I'm going to turn to 2021 in the hope that I'll be able to deal with this a little bit more quickly from this point on. At the beginning of 2021, with cases continuing to be recorded at record levels, on the 4th of January, mainland Scotland was placed under lockdown until the end of January. Beginning from midnight, schools were closed and people ordered to stay at home, except for essential purposes. For the sake of clarity, this lockdown, which is normally referred to in Scotland as the second lockdown, was not in reality a national lockdown, as the first had been, as it covered only the mainland of Scotland, which had been in Tier 4 restrictions to that point. The island areas remained in Tier 3, although certain island areas were moved into Tier 4 during January 2021 to control spikes in cases there. On the 19th of January 2021, the Scottish Government extended the second lockdown until mid-February. Schools remained closed. On the 2nd of March, it was confirmed that all secondary school pupils would return to the classroom part-time from the 15th of March, with priority given to those in years due to take public examinations. With COVID cases at their lowest in 5 months, the First Minister suggested lockdown measures could be lifted faster than scheduled. On the 9th of March, the Scottish Government announced a slight easing of the rules, allowing 4 people from 2 separate households to meet up outdoors, or 4 youngsters aged 12 to 17 from 4 separate households to meet up from Friday the 12th. Outdoor non-contact sports would be allowed on the same day. Communal worship of no more than 50 people would be allowed from the 26th. On the same date, following England's announcement that the 5 of its Nightingale hospitals would close, the Scottish Government confirmed that the NHS Louisa Jordan would stay open for the time being. However, by the 18th of March, it was announced that it would close at the end of the month. On the 16th of March, Nicola Sturgeon set out the easing of restrictions in Scotland. The plan was the stay-at-home order would be lifted on the 2nd of April in favour of a stay-local order within local authority areas. However, by the 26th of March 2021, figures from the Office for National Statistics indicated Scotland to have the highest COVID infection rate in the UK. On the 2nd of April, the stay-at-home order was, however, lifted and replaced with a 3-week stay-local order that required people to stay within their local council areas. On the 16th of April, the stay-local rule was lifted for Scotland. The 6th of May 2021 was a significant day in Scotland. Figures published by Public Health Scotland showed Scotland had experienced its first 7-day period without any COVID deaths for 8 months, with no deaths recorded between the 29th of April and the 5th of May. The 6th of May 2021 was also the day on which elections to the Scottish Parliament took place. Voter turnout was the highest in a Scottish Parliament election to date, at 63%. The SNP finished with 64 seats, just short of an overall majority. In the aftermath of the election, previous Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Jean Freeman, not having stood for re-election, Nicola Sturgeon appointed Humza Yousaf to the role of Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care. The picture at that time, faced by the new Health Secretary, whose previous portfolio had been Justice, involved a plan for a gradual move out of the restrictions which had led to the second lockdown. Indeed, on the 8th of May, Scotland recorded a day without any COVID-related deaths. The changing roles of the key decision-makers in the Scottish Government at around this time, due to the election and the Government's changing priorities, will be examined during the course of the module. In the aftermath of the election, on the 18th of May, Deputy First Minister John Swinney was appointed as Minister for COVID Recovery. On the 17th of May, most of mainland Scotland, with the exception of Moray and Glasgow, which had seen a recent rise in cases, moved from Level 3 to Level 2 restrictions. As before, the Scottish Government over this period continued to prescribe which level of restrictions should apply to which local authority areas based on local data. Local outbreaks took place, including in Glasgow and Dundee. On the 22nd of June 2021, the Scottish Government set a date of the 9th of August for the lifting of all COVID restrictions in Scotland, whilst delaying the next tranche of changes, the move from Level 1 to Level 0 for the Scottish mainland, from the 28th of June to the 19th of July. The decision was in the context of the highest number of daily COVID cases since the start of mass testing, 2,969, in Scotland being reported the very next day, with a gender gap having appeared up in recent days, 2/3 of those aged 15 to 44 being testing positive for the illness being male. On the 30th of June 2021, a total of 1,991 COVID cases in Scotland were linked to Euro 2020 football matches, with 2/3 of them stemming from Scotland's game against England at Wembley on the 18th of June. On the 1st of July, the number of daily COVID cases in Scotland passed 4,000 for the first time. This led to significant pressure on contact tracing systems. On the 5th of July, the World Health Organization, in its figures, placed Scotland as one of the top COVID hotspots in Europe, something National Clinical Director Jason Leach attributed to a lack of natural immunity in the population. On the 17th of July, with the mass vaccination centre at Glasgow's SSE Hydro set to close, opposition politicians urged the Scottish Government to keep it operating. The clinic was being closed in order to prepare for the venue for the UN Climate Change Conference, which eventually took place in November 2021. By the 18th of July 2021, all adults had been offered a vaccination. However, it was reported that 1/3 of younger people in Scotland remained unvaccinated. Despite the rising cases, the announced relaxation of the restrictions continued as planned, with Scotland moving to level 0 restrictions on the 19th of July, allowing a larger number of people to meet up indoors, as well as attending weddings and funerals. COVID deaths in Scotland continued to rise, 47 in death certificates in the week between the 12th and 18th of July, a rise of 16 on the previous week. A key feature of this period in Scotland from the summer of 2021 was that hospitals started to become overwhelmed as a result of the impact of local cases of infection caused by the Delta variant. As early as the 7th of July 2021, NHS Grampian had placed 2 hospitals on code black status, meaning the cancellation of non-urgent procedures. They reached full capacity following a rise in COVID cases in the area and a consequent rise in hospital admissions, combined with staff absences due to self-isolation requirements. By the 13th of August, 4 health boards had cancelled non-urgent procedures and outpatient appointments amid rising pressure from COVID. However, on the 9th of August, the bulk of pandemic-related restrictions were removed. As for the later period, this was dominated, my lady, as you know from Module 2 evidence, by the later Delta infection and the arrival of Omicron. On the 16th of August 2021, most schools returned after the summer holidays. Following the move in August to level 0, on the 24th of August, Scotland recorded 4,323 daily cases. Nicola Sturgeon indicated that she could not rule out the reintroduction of some COVID measures, but that said that these would be limited and as proportionate as possible. Cases continued to rise significantly. The 27th of August showed Scotland had recorded 6,835 new cases. Nicola Sturgeon said the Scottish Government was not considering the introduction of a circuit breaker. By late August 2021, figures indicated that COVID cases had virtually doubled each week since the lifting of restrictions on the 9th of August, leading to an increase in hospitalisations. National Clinical Director Professor Jason Leach suggested a reverse gear may be needed with some restrictions. A number of large-scale events were reintroduced, and Nicola Sturgeon confirmed on the 1st of September that vaccine passports would be required for people who wish to enter nightclubs or attend large events. The practicality of the plans was questioned by a number of organisations, including the Scottish Professional Football League. The next day, Hamza Youssef claimed the benefits of Scotland's planned COVID passport scheme for large-scale events outweighed the concerns and were preferable to another lockdown. This would prove to be a controversial means of seeking to manage infections over this period. The Scottish Parliament voted to approve the scheme on the 9th of September, meaning adults had to be fully vaccinated to enter nightclubs and large events from the 1st of October. Opposition to the scheme culminated in an ultimately unsuccessful legal challenge against Scotland's vaccine passport scheme the day before its launch. In the midst of rising cases and the launch of schemes like the vaccine passport scheme to manage infections in a low restriction environment, on the 7th of September 2021, Nicola Sturgeon confirmed that work would resume on plans for a second independence referendum. She said the next day that her plans to hold a second independence referendum in 2 years were realistic, despite the difficulties of COVID. On the same day, it was estimated that 1 in 45 people had COVID in Scotland, the highest number since records began. The pressures on the stretched NHS in Scotland, which had required a number of areas to suspend non-urgent procedures in the summer, continued. By the 16th of September 2021, the Scottish Government required to ask the Ministry of Defence for military assistance for Scotland's ambulance service. Nicola Sturgeon described the situation as being the most challenging set of circumstances in history because of COVID. The unrelenting pressure on the NHS and the drastic measures required to combat it continued throughout October. On the 23rd of October, NHS Greater Glasgow urged patients only to attend A&E if their issue was life-threatening. On the 3rd of November, the Scottish Government set out proposals for non-emergency A&E patients to be redirected to other areas of the NHS. Military help for hospitals continued. In late November, reports of a new Omicron variant were received. By the 9th of December, Public Health Scotland urged people to cancel Christmas parties, claiming a number of Omicron cases were linked to these. This led to the hospitality industry reporting non-stop cancellations the very next day. By the 10th of December 2021, the First Minister indicated that Scotland faced a tsunami of Omicron cases, with it likely to become the dominant variant of COVID within days. She announced changes to self-isolation rules from the next day. On the 24th of December, Professor Leach urged people to enjoy Christmas, but to be cautious. On that day, the number of daily COVID cases in Scotland hit its highest point since August, with 7,076 new cases reported. On Boxing Day, fresh restrictions were brought in as an attempt to halt the spread of Omicron, including the cancellation of all large-scale events. As in the previous year, Edinburgh's Hogmanay Street Party was cancelled, although this year crowds did gather. On the 27th of December, 1 metre physical distancing was reintroduced for the hospitality and leisure sectors, while hospitality were required to provide table service only. On the 29th of December, a further 15,849 cases were reported, the highest daily figure so far. Scots were warned not to travel to England as a way of circumventing Scotland's tighter COVID rules. On the 3rd of January 2022, Scotland had reported 20,217 cases, again its highest daily figure. On the 6th of January, the number of confirmed cases in Scotland since the start of the pandemic had passed 1 million. On that day, Humza Yousaf indicated that the then current COVID infection rates in Scotland were in line with the worst case scenario. On the 23rd of January, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon appeared on BBC's Sunday morning programme and stated that although she understood the very adverse effect of Scotland's COVID measures and the effect their measures had on business and hospitality, she believed they had been worth it. On the 28th of January, the rules on physical distancing and the wearing of face masks in certain circumstances were relaxed. The changes applied to indoor settings such as religious services. On the 8th of February, Nicola Sturgeon announced that Scotland was through the worst of Omicron, though 31 people were still being treated for COVID in intensive care. By the 21st of March, the number of hospital patients testing positive for COVID in Scotland reached a new high of 2,182, but ICU admissions remained relatively low in comparison, as the latest variant caused more mild symptoms. Even late in the period with which this module is concerned, on the 23rd of March 2022, NHS Glasgow and Clyde, Scotland's biggest health board, was warning it was facing COVID pressures that were as serious as it gets, due to a combination of record numbers of COVID patients and staff absences. Advice remained that people should only attend accident emergency units if their condition was very serious or life-threatening. On the 28th of April, the Scottish Government announced that public health advice would change to the stay-at-home message, replacing self-isolation from the 1st of May. Testing for the general population and contact tracing would end, with testing sites closing, though testing would remain available to certain groups. It was announced that NHS Scotland would be taken out of its emergency footing at the end of the 30th of April. My Lady, we intend to examine these later significant outbreaks of infection in Scotland at a time when statistics suggest that both infection and the consequences were higher in Scotland than in other areas. Though there was a focus in the early stages of the pandemic on the need to manage the pressures on the NHS, it seems to be the case that over this period, hospital services were allowed to wane for all. My Lady, I'll turn briefly now to deal with a number of other areas which we intend to deal with in the module, having come to the end of my chronology. I intend to deal with these briefly, and I've touched upon a number of them already, but the purpose of this really, my lady, is to give people an indication, insofar as we are able publicly at this stage, to tell people the types of witnesses that we intend to call. I've already said, my lady, that both data and advisory systems are a key part of the module, and that we will be looking at them in some detail. The starting point of the process of providing accurate advice to government is, of course, the requirement to have access to accurate and timely data. We will, in this module, investigate with a number of relevant witnesses the data access systems that were available to the Scottish Government, in particular access to local data as the pandemic progressed and more local solutions became the way that the pandemic was managed. Furthermore, my lady, the significance of data, and in particular local data and modelling, will be examined with appropriate witnesses from as early as tomorrow, as well as whether accurate local data was available to assist modellers in the Scottish response. We will ask about the extent to which factors such as the economy, non-COVID health-related concerns, inequalities, education, mental health and societal issues form part of modelling in Scotland. Were they modelled effectively by or on behalf of the Scottish Government, and were the models assimilated effectively into their decision-making systems? We will also hear, my lady, as I've already said, from a number of key representatives from the advisory bodies which provided advice to the Scottish Government. That, of course, will mean hearing from a number of members of the Scottish COVID Advisory Group, to which I've already made reference. We will also examine with witnesses a number of other groups that were set up during the course of the pandemic to provide Scottish Government with advice on various matters. The role and operation of all of these bodies and the extent to which they provided advice to the Government, the extent to which that advice was properly understood, assimilated and acted upon in the Scottish Government's ongoing response, will be assessed with appropriate witnesses. We will, as I've already said, my lady, touch in our analysis of the overall Scottish Government strategy on a number of key components of that strategy, including NHS capacity, the important issue of care, to which I've already made significant reference, the role of border controls and schools. We will examine also the methodology behind the way in which key public health messages was formulated and disseminated by the Scottish Government. We will consider what advice was taken, including from behavioural scientists and other expert advisors, as to how the message about the way in which the pandemic was being managed should best be communicated, and what was required in accordance with government policy. We will examine the rationale for the communication policy and the reasons why it was or was not effective. We will also, as has been the case extensively, if I recall, in the previous module, look at ways in which ministers, other decision makers and key advisors themselves went about complying with the regulations, although this, I think, on our analysis, plays a lesser role than the extensive evidence you've heard about that in Module 2. We will also, my lady, have a look with appropriate witnesses, including ministerial witnesses, at the funding arrangements to which I've made reference, given the fact that the Treasury is a reserve matter. Looking at funding necessarily has a cross-border element, but it appears to be the case that this played an important role in the way in which the pandemic was managed, or could be managed, in Scotland. My lady, we will also hear from witnesses in relation to the way in which COVID-19 related legislation and regulations were enacted in Scotland, in particular the use of emergency powers. And you'll hear, my lady, from a legal academic who has looked to the issue of whether the way that powers was used was appropriate and adequately ensured that the executive's use of the legislative process was proportionate in the circumstances. We will also, my lady, look to an extent at the enforcement of the rules, in particular the rationale for the use of criminal sanctions, the use of threats of greater sanctions by the Scottish Government to seek to maximise compliance. We will examine research and conclusions reached by an academic, a member of Police Scotland's independent advisory group during the pandemic, on the police's use of fixed penalty notices to enforce coronavirus-related rules. Lady, in the course of the hearing, in order to deal with these matters, you will hear tomorrow, first of all, from a number of interest groups who happen to be core participants in our module. You will hear from a representative of Scottish COVID Bereave, from whom you've heard in previous modules, a representative from Inclusion Scotland and from the Scottish TUC. Later in the week, you will also hear from a representative of Scottish Care. During the course of the hearings, my lady, you will hear, as I have said, from witnesses who played a pivotal role in a number of aspects of decision-making in Scotland, including those who were responsible for the compilation of data, those who carried out modelling, civil servants and other political advisors, and ultimately, as well as medical and other administrative advisors, those who made decisions, the ministers themselves. Lady, I've set out what I hope is a helpful introduction to the issues and the key events which will be addressed in the module. We intend to address the key decisions of government in Scotland in order to be able to assess their reasonableness, proportionality and effectiveness. It would be right to acknowledge that none of these key decisions was an easy one. Decisions taken during the course of a pandemic by our political leaders were a matter of life or death. They were thus taken under circumstances of considerable pressure. They were often taken with imperfect information, both about the threat, but also about the consequences of any proposed countermeasure. In light of these considerations, it would be wrong in these circumstances to seek to judge the actions of those who took decisions about the management of the pandemic in Scotland by the application of a counsel of perfection. No political leader can be expected to perform perfectly in everything they do. However, in a civilised country like Scotland, which claimed, as you have heard in Module 1, to have had good ready-made systems for the management of emergencies like the pandemic, leaders ought to be judged by the standard of whether they took reasonable decisions in the interests of the public in whose name they were empowered to act. The judgment of what was or was not reasonable will ultimately be a matter for you, my lady, when you write your report. What was reasonable at one point in the narrative may differ from what was reasonable at another, given the fast-moving pace of a deadly virus, emerging and developing levels of knowledge, differing priorities and potential harms. The reasonableness of decision-making depends not only on the knowledge which was available, but what ought to have been available to maximise the chances of the best decisions being made. Equally, it depends on practical considerations, which may vary from time to time and from country to country. For example, what was reasonable for the Scottish people may differ from what was done in other countries based on the particular characteristics and priorities of the Scottish people. For example, the state of their health and thus the threat which the virus posed, the presence of health inequalities or the age of the population. What was reasonable may differ from time to time, given the particular dynamics of the spread of the virus and other practical matters such as the capacity of the NHS, the availability of protective measures such as testing, PPE or vaccine, and the shifting priorities and requirements of the people at any given time. Equally, what was reasonable in the early pandemic may be judged differently from what was done as the pandemic progressed. It would have been reasonable, we submit, to have learned from the experience as it was going along, to seek to improve the quality of the response. We will examine whether this occurred. In evidence which has been heard by the inquiry in previous modules, in particular Module 2, which much has been made by political leaders of the need to use hindsight to reflect upon decisions. In our view, the use of hindsight has a value, but it is not necessary or useful always to judge action or inaction in light of what we now know, but which may not have been known or reasonably anticipated at the time. A key function of the inquiry is to seek to make recommendations as to how things might be done better in the future, both as regards general systems for taking good decisions, but particularly for any future health emergency of the nature of the pandemic. Often hindsight may be used to seek to avoid responsibility by claiming that it is only in light of what is now known and not what was known or ought reasonably to have been known at the time that certain alternative courses of action could be deemed to have been preferable or more reasonable. Though using what is now known has a value in seeking to inform the most up-to-date and hence useful recommendations for the future, your function requires us also to take care not simply to excuse decision makers from taking responsibility based on their assertion that it is only by the use of hindsight that we now know that decisions could or should have been taken not as they were. We intend to do so. in order to assess both the reasonableness and proportionality of decision-making at the time and how to inform things which might be done better in the future, we intend to analyse in some detail the systems which were employed to reach key decisions in the management of the pandemic in Scotland. The extent to which these systems and defects in them contributed to the outcomes which have been experienced by the people of Scotland deserves careful reflection and assessment for the future. What were the key decisions? Who took the key decisions in the then current system? Upon what evidence base did they do so? Was there proper consideration of the relevant competing harms which action or inaction would entail? If not, why not? Did systems change? If they did, why did they, and how effective were those changes? If they did not, why did they not? These are the questions which we will explore. As I've set out already, decision-making in Scotland requires to be judged and analysed in the context of its particular political system. It shaped the decisions which individuals or groups were able to make, and hence plays an important part of the process of analysing the reasonableness of the key decisions taken. We intend to examine whether that system passed the test. If it did not do so, it cannot be fit for its primary purpose, to protect the welfare of the people of Scotland. Equally, limitations on the ability to act should not be used as an excuse for a failure to act in circumstances where the power and responsibility existed to find a way to protect the Scottish people against the threat. We will explore the extent to which those charged with the responsibility to do so sought to find the best way within our constitutional system to serve their primary purpose. As the narrative shows, Scotland developed its own strategies for fighting the virus at some point early in the first lockdown. Could and should it have done so earlier? When it developed new systems to facilitate doing so, was that the right path to take? To what extent was it reasonable to have developed new systems for decision-making when existing systems, both Scottish and UK-wide, existed? In the fight against a virus which did not respect man-made boundaries or systems, was going it alone a reasonable course to take? Central to the determinations with which the inquiry and ultimately you are charged in this module, my lady, are the advisory systems which were employed in reaching key decisions for Scotland. Ministers said they were following the science and often appeared, both at UK level and within the Scottish Government, publicly alongside medical or other scientific advisors to add the weight of scientific advice to their judgments. Did they understand, probe and analyse the advice which they received sufficiently? What did they make of it, and what advice did they base their key decisions on? As we have seen, the Scottish Government devised its own advisory systems, largely during the first lockdown, on a variety of social and medical matters. To what extent were the new advisory systems adequately constituted, and was scientific and non-scientific advice properly taken into account when the key decisions were reached? Those who are charged with taking the key decisions in the management of the pandemic response in Scotland and in the exercise of their public responsibilities require to be held to account for the decisions they took or at times did not take. Our terms of reference require us to seek to do so. In circumstances such as this, where the Scottish public has faced unprecedented harm, physical, mental and emotional, and ultimately death and bereavement as a result of the rampaging virus, they deserve an investigation into the key decisions which were designed to prevent these things occurring. Equally, those who have suffered as a result of the untold harm caused by the countermeasures taken to combat the virus, the physical, mental, social, educational, personal, economic and other harm, deserve to have these decisions analysed too. We intend to do just that in this module. Thank you very much, my lady. That concludes my opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr Dawson. Claire Mitchell-Casey.
I am Claire Mitchell, King's Counsel, and along with my colleagues Kevin McCaffrey and Kevin Henry, are instructed by Amar Anwar and Company solicitors on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved at both the UK and Scottish public inquiries. In Module 1, we learned that as a result of the policy of austerity, the vulnerable became more vulnerable, the poor poorer, the sick sicker. Life expectancy declined. The NHS was chronically underfunded. Added to this, preparations for Brexit took place, replacing any work on pandemic planning, leaving the UK virtually defenceless. Despite the benefit of time, of watching in real time the wave of COVID sweep towards the UK shores, the politicians, and in particular the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, prevaricated, volleyed, flip-flopped in the deadly days of delay, during which action ought to have been taken as the disease quickly multiplied and overtook the UK. So far in Module 2, the Scottish COVID bereaved has sought to understand the UK Government's initial response, to find out about decision-making by our central government, the politicians, civil servants, special advisers. Repeatedly, politicians, and it is politicians in particular, asked to offer their condolences to the bereaved. They expressed their views on how important this inquiry was. Yet, when it came to answering questions, there were repeated instances of obfuscation. The view taken on the evidence is a matter for the Chair alone. But the view of the Scottish COVID bereaved is that when presented with evidence or asked to comment on issues not in their favour, explanations were tendered that would strain the belief of even the most gullible. The then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's inability to act decisively was repackaged with a philosophical spin. His lack of ability to harness what he considered to be the greatest tool in the pandemic, that of communication, was not reflected on with any form of acceptance, despite there have been very many significant examples flagged up by an independent expert of his and his colleagues' inability to properly define what rules were to be followed by whom. In evidence, he seized upon the idea that in a future pandemic, any Prime Minister should speak to the whole of the UK as if it was a revelatory idea, rather than the actual job he should have been carrying out. Finally, both he and Mr Gove seem interested in exploring a topic, the source of the pandemic, which was not within the scope of the inquiry, terms indeed which Mr Johnson had set, a red herring which the press ate up. The toxic, misogynistic and macho atmosphere at the centre of government was presented as an environment to get the best out of people, where there appeared to be no recognition of the fact that their characterisation was not shared by the senior civil servants working in it, and that this environment sidelined and excluded women, and perhaps more specifically importantly for government, sidestepped the procedural safeguards of collective decision-making in Cabinet. Our present Prime Minister, Mr Rishi Sunak, was able to remember very little of some very important decisions and conversations that took place when he was present, yet when on more solid ground was able to point to the detail of evidence which supported his position. His recollections were clear. The reason for highlighting the foregoing, my lady, is that in this present module, the Scottish COVID bereaved wish to say loudly and clearly to the politicians in Scotland that they want better. On behalf of their relatives, they deserve better. They want politicians to answer questions put to them directly, to reflect upon their time during the pandemic, and they want them to wholly engage in the process of finding out what happened, putting politics and political careers aside. Quite frankly, the work of this inquiry is more important. Considered and careful reflection on what went wrong, what went on, and how things could have been done better may literally save lives in the next pandemic. We would ask that politicians in particular remember this when they come to give evidence. In Module 2, some of the best evidence, the most unguarded contemporaneous evidence, came from informal methods of communication such as WhatsApp. The sorry history of the difficulty that this inquiry has had obtaining those documents from the Scottish Government is cause for considerable concern to the Scottish COVID bereaved. Media reports have suggested that senior figures in the pandemic decision-making, such as Nicola Sturgeon and Jason Leach, have failed to retain messages. If these reports are correct, the Scottish COVID bereaved hope that, whatever evidence may be gleaned from surviving WhatsApps, nothing of significance has been lost, as a result of this apparently willful deletion of messages. The Scottish COVID bereaved are further aware from media reports that it may be suggested that as final decisions were not taken via WhatsApp, there was no need to retain these important messages. They look forward to hearing how politicians and civil servants attempt to justify this position. Are the people of Scotland to believe that the Scottish Government placed no reliance on informal messaging services which were routinely used by individuals and businesses throughout the pandemic? As the inquiry will no doubt hear, in March and April 2021, promises were made not only to the Scottish COVID bereaved, but the people of Scotland in the manifesto on which the members of the Scottish Government stood, that there would be a public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic. It ought to have been obvious to politicians, advisers and civil servants from at least then, if not earlier, that evidence of contemporaneous discussions in relation to the pandemic response would be of vital importance to the subsequent inquiry. Were no steps taken to secure these messages? Did the deletion of messages continue after spring 2021? The Scottish COVID bereaved listened with great concern as counsel to the inquiry set out at the previous preliminary hearing the difficulties faced by the inquiry in securing evidence from the Scottish Government. It is hoped that this is not indicative of the approach to be taken at the hearings. As noted, one of the recommendations suggested by the group at the end of Module 2 is the retention of all messages in whatever form that relate to the business of government. It's hoped that this is a lesson which has not been learned too late. As the inquiry is aware, the Scottish COVID bereaved represent just some of those who lost their loved ones in Scotland. As of June last year, there were more than 17,000 deaths in Scotland where COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate. Each one of those deaths is a tragedy. While witnesses in this module may point to opinion polling during the pandemic favourably, contrasting the Scottish Government's communication and strategy with that of the UK Government, positive poll numbers are no consolation to the bereaved. If Bute House was not as chaotic as Downing Street, if the Scottish Government's public health messaging was to be preferred to that of the UK, if at no point were decisions taken in Scotland for political reasons, why did so many lose their lives in Scotland? Did our politicians fail to protect some of the most vulnerable in our society, such as those in care homes? Of course, it's been suggested that the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and other Scottish politicians were playing politics rather than properly engaging in the decision-making to save lives. Was this projection by the UK politicians as to their own behaviour, or is there truth in this? Were cancellations of mass gatherings totemic? Were decisions taken to lift lockdown at a different time from England just for the sake of doing things differently, or a reflection of a different stage of the progress of the virus? Was a decision to change masks in school policy another example of taking a separate decision from the rest of the UK? Was the Scottish Government sidelined, excluded from crucial decision-making? Were meetings of COBRA a sham to be nice to the devolved administrations? Was the democratic process in Scotland undermined by the UK Government? Equally, were politicians happy to accentuate political and constitutional differences to distract from similar policies either side of the border? Was valuable time and valuable resource wasted in pursuing futile elimination strategy? The Scottish COVID bereaved hope these questions, and of course the very many questions posed by my learned friend this morning, will be answered in full. As the Chair knows, questions about decisions taken in relation to COVID contracted in hospital and care home deaths are of the utmost interest to those in the Scottish COVID bereaved. It is, of course, acknowledged and must be remembered that further additional evidence will be laid about those in later modules. The SCBA would also like to take the opportunity to highlight what was said in the closing speech in Module 2 regarding the press. The press, as the fourth estate, has an important part to play in acting as a legitimate political safeguard, performing a watchdog function over the branches of government. The SCBA welcomes the part the press has to play in doing so. However, there have been calculated attempts to undermine the work of this inquiry in some sections of the media, including not only attacks on the work of the inquiry, but personal attacks on those involved. It is clear that such attacks have had no effect. But let the Scottish COVID bereaved be clear. Any attack on the work of the UK COVID inquiry is an attack on the bereaved, who want the work of this inquiry to be a legacy for those that they loved and lost. Finally, we'd like to place on record the assistance and forbearance of the inquiry team, and in particular Mr Dawson KC, who in particular in the last few days, as we've had discussions, has made every effort to ensure that he has considered a number of specific issues that the Scottish COVID bereaved would like to raise. These are the opening submissions for Module 2A on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. Mr Freedman, Danny Freedman, KC.
Good afternoon. We act for two disabled people's organisations, or DPO. They are Inclusion Scotland and Disability Rights UK. And we are grateful to be addressing you in Scotland as part of an inquiry that is looking at all four governments in a way that no UK inquiry has done before. My lady, the Scottish Government is a government that seeks to adhere to the social model of disability, that disabled people are disabled by the barriers they face in society rather than the impairments they overcome, and in that sense, their inequalities are chosen. It is a government that also wants to be judged by its compliance with human rights law, not just the civil and political rights contained in the European Convention of Human Rights, but the broader obligations and social and economic rights contained in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UN CRPD. However, despite this, the social model and equal rights of disabled people remain a work in progress in Scotland. Across the UK, the pandemic shows that recognition of values without redistribution of assets is not enough. It is not enough to recognise the value of disabled people's lives. There must be redistribution. Redistribution of political resources in terms of the influence that disabled people can have upon the policies that affect them, and redistribution of economic resources, in the sense that if a society is serious about valuing the dignity and diversity of human life, disabled people will need more economic resources, not less. My lady, 5 points of context, please, that are important to this module. First, the number of disabled people in Scotland may be as high as 35% of the population, compared to UK overall figures that range from 20 to 22%. Second, health inequalities in Scotland are the highest in the UK and some of the highest in Western and Central Europe. This is with respect an older, more unwell and lower income population that was more susceptible to COVID-19 harm, and especially so for some of its disabled population, given the virus's risk to people of older age with learning disabilities and with certain comorbidities. Third, disabled people were in an emergency before COVID-19 began. They were made vulnerable and their resilience compromised by cuts to benefits and services. You will see the truly humbling figures concerning standard of living, housing, employment gaps and pay gaps. My lady will also hear this week from Dr. Jim Elder Woodward. He is both a renowned exponent of independent living and one of its great experts. His evidence tells you that despite all the insight and extended network that he has, his situation before the pandemic was near to collapse. And by the end of March 2020, he had suffered a nervous and physical breakdown under the weight of the changes that were happening to him, and likewise the very significant numbers of people like him who lost services and were trapped in their homes. Fourth, the Scottish Government has staked its reputation on its commitment to being more values-based than its Westminster counterpart. Before the pandemic, it sought to mainstream awareness of health inequalities as a cross-government concern. It registered its commitments to human rights and specifically disabled people's rights by introducing a delivery plan to achieve better compliance with the UN CRPD. While Westminster government was often silent about or against international human rights law and any dedicated economics to end health inequalities, Scottish government was vocal in its commitment to both. Fifth, the pandemic took place amidst a crisis of devolution, and disabled people's experience exemplifies this crisis. Scotland has used its finances to mitigate some features of austerity economics, for example, refusing to apply the bedroom tax and maintaining existing guarantees of the Independent Living Fund when the fund was abolished across the rest of the UK. However, in key ways that would impact during the pandemic, Scottish Government was neither independent nor alternative. For instance, in the provision of social care, which has been allowed to operate beyond proper central government control. Overall, Scotland's capacity for any type of unilateral governance was compromised by the constitutional funding arrangements under devolution. Scotland's choices on the timing and scope of MPIs were starkly limited by the choices of UK government. It did not have the funding to do otherwise. Turning then to COVID governance. As my lady knows from Module 2, the DPO encouraged you to see how government can go wrong for disabled people generally, but especially during an emergency, by considering 9 critical areas. The purpose of the method is to break down the various points in decision-making when disabled people can be overlooked or damaged, even when a government believes itself to be doing the right thing. The first area is system. How did disabled people feature in the overall system of Scottish Government of Emergencies? Despite concern for health inequalities in Scottish politics and its stated priorities to protect disabled people's rights, the Scottish Government, like its UK English counterpart, did not systematically assess social and economic inequalities in the context of pandemic planning at all before 2020. That included a failure to consult at all with the Scottish DPO on the subject. Then in the first months of the pandemic, previous levels of government consultation with DPO on matters affecting disabled people, which were otherwise better than in England, dramatically diminished as regards the emergency response. Under conditions of an unplanned for crisis, a Scottish government that aspired to be genuinely and deeply engaged with civil society, and in that respect different from its Westminster counterpart, reverted to a system of more conventional top-down elite control. Not how it would like to be seen, but maybe what it needs to acknowledge. Devolution also mattered. It meant Scotland initially followed an outdated UK plan that was based on influenza, considerably dependent on UK funding, and complicated by Brexit, all of which narrowed options for any radical independent initiative to alter the fate of disabled people and other at-risk groups. The second area is planning. What planning was there for disabled people in Scotland going into the pandemic and thereafter? Going in, we know there was essentially nothing, and in that respect, Scotland had violated an obligation under Article 11 of the UN CRPD to plan to protect disabled people to disasters, just as the UK had done. What Scotland then did was to design a decision-making strategy and publicise its approach. In late April 2020, the government published the COVID-19 Framework for Decision-Making, which incorporated considerations of the direct and indirect harms posed by the virus to health, to society, and to the economy, the so-called Four Harms approach. The policy emphasised that, quote, harms caused do not impact everyone equally, unquote, and combined to, quote, protect those most at risk and protect human rights. This was a clearer, more human-centred and values-based approach than ever emerged from the UK government with a degree of consistency or stability. Health and broader inequalities were also an immediate focus across government civil servants responsible for equality, who from the outset were involved in key public sector planning meetings. Officials of the Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Directorate attended the Communities and Public Services Ministerial Group from its inception on the 2nd of April 2020, and both briefed and attended the formal Four Harms meetings. My Lady knows that their attendance in the UK ministerial meetings was far later and far fewer. But how actually responsive to disabled people's needs was the Scottish Government? It seems to have been slightly ahead of the UK in realising the needs of socially vulnerable people beyond the shielding list. It corrected its initial disengagement from the DPO when pushed to do so, and continued that engagement for somewhat longer when the UK government quickly jettisoned their own DPO forum. The Scottish Government also enjoyed a more sustained level of support from society than its Westminster counterpart. However, not all features of Scottish Government worked effectively, which begins with our third area, machinery of government. How did that machinery configure in order to properly represent disabled people's interests? In the Scottish directorate-based structure, there was no Minister for Disabled People. That responsibility was part of Christina McKelvey's portfolio as Minister for Older People and Equalities. However, she describes herself as having, quote, no decision-making responsibility, unquote, with regard to COVID-19. Consequently, like Minister Justin Tomlinson in the UK, she did not attend the public sector ministerial group or the Four Harms groups, which begs the question as to who during COVID decision-making was holding the line for disabled people and ensuring that the social model of disability was upheld and the human rights of disabled people were complied with. The fourth area concerns expertise. Did expert advice to Scottish governments sufficiently take disabled people into account? The DPO say no. Despite the creation of a Scottish scientific advisory group, decisions in Scotland remained affected by UK sage advice and or the significant role played by the UK CMO and CSO. First, it was Professor Whitty's unplanned comments that promulgated the notion of behavioural fatigue that UK ministers relied on to delay the first lockdown. This concept was not supported by SAGE members of SPI-B, nor by Professor Stephen Riker, also a member of the Scottish COVID Advisory Group. Scotland, with its greater clinically at-risk population, could all the less afford that margin of error. Second, on core issues of clinical vulnerability, Scotland followed England, such that the timing of placing those with Down syndrome on the CEV list was dependent on the English Q-COVID initiative and was delayed until November 2020. The implication of that would contribute to those with learning disabilities being 3 times more likely to die of COVID in Scotland and 2 times more likely to be hospitalised. And third, as Scotland was dependent on UK economic packages to support MPIs, SAGE advice would trump Scottish advice because COVID could not afford to fund significant countermeasures that were not part of UK-wide virus suppression decisions. Finally, notwithstanding that my lady will hear from Professor Riker, the COVID advisory group remained predominantly biomedical in expertise and focused on the epidemiological harm posed by the virus. As with SAGE and the Whitehall Disability Unit, what was lacking was a broader scope of expertise to deal with health inequalities, including both practitioners, DPO and other end user groups that understood the social determinants of disabled people's vulnerability. All of that has consequences for the fifth area in terms of what recognition was given to disabled people in pandemic decision making. Was it recognition that realised disabled people's discrete experience and agency in relation to the MPIs? Or were disabled people subsumed into a notion of vulnerability that conceals more about the social and economic making of vulnerability than actually addressing disabled people's needs? Compared to England, Scottish civil servants were more focused on the issue. there was early caution communicated to cabinet ministers to, quote, refine use of terminology of vulnerable and high risk to avoid alienating effect. But the critique of vulnerability is not just about being kind. It's about government becoming sufficiently responsive to needs. It remains unclear how the four harms approach translated into solutions to problems identified, or whether it simply acted as a mechanism whereby harms were identified and considered, but actions went ahead in any event. The Four Harms Group itself did not hold its first meeting until the 24th of October 2020. As with the general critique of expertise, it remains to be seen how informed the group was of disabled people's perspective. That leads to the sixth area, which is engagement. How did Scottish COVID governance engage with disabled people, and especially the DPO, as the lived experts in their own lives? The obligation under Article 4.3 of the UN CRPD is to actively involve and closely consult with disabled people, including DPO, in matters that affect them. And one of the overriding duties of the Convention is to ensure effective participation. Compared to the UK and England, Scotland does it better. However, the disengagement in the first months mattered, because that is the point in time when the lives of disabled people were dramatically turned upside down. If one reason why there was disengagement from the DPOs at the beginning of the crisis was because Scottish Government reverted to a Westminster governing style, another reason might be that progressive governments can sometimes fall foul of the belief that because they are progressive, they know best. However, to respond effectively to emergency, you must also know what you are responding to. The seventh area is data. Was the impact of both the virus and the MPIs on disabled people properly counted and deployed by Scotland's data architecture? Under Article 31 of the UN CRPD, it should have been, but there are significant reasons to find that it was not. Mortality rates for disabled people in Scotland were only compiled once in March 2021. Until then, Scotland had to rely on English data. As in England, there was also a design fault in the failure of health services to gather data or broader surveys to ask social questions. Instead, the tendency was to focus on individual impairment alone. Access to reliable and timely data was not available in relation to care homes and with potentially grave consequences. The eighth area is protection. How far was Scottish Government able to protect its disabled population from the damage of both COVID and the countermeasures? The powerful criticism of Inclusion Scotland in its report Rights at Risk was that there was, quote, an abyss between the rhetoric of national policies and what happens on the ground. There was the sudden withdrawal of home support, which meant loss of food, medication, basic capacity and hygiene. There was mass death in residential settings, more so in the first wave in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. Although documentation of DNA CPR is woefully limited, experiential accounts show that the issue was drastically lacking in accountability or control. Education for disabled children was severely compromised. When lockdown measures required those with mental illness to stay at home, they were left too much in isolation. Finally, the increasing resort to government via the internet resulted in massive digital exclusion for disabled people and others. The ninth area is redistribution. Was it enough to recognise the vulnerability of disabled people in Scotland without sufficient economic redistribution to support their needs? The DPO criticism of UK pandemic economics is that rather than being radical as presented and sometimes criticised, it involved the deliberate maintenance of the status quo. For disabled people, furlough payments were focused on those able to work or temporarily unable to work in standard wage sectors and did not reach lower, informal or non-wage earning people. The increase in universal credit was small compared to sums spent on business. Limited provision of sick pay was known to be highly relevant to part-time and zero-hours workers already in poverty, continuing to work with fatal consequences. COVID economics was not always Scotland's alone to define, but its own lump funding into local authority schemes was difficult to access and not particularly accountable. These criticisms have travelled into Scotland's post-pandemic debates about creating a national care service. That agenda is relevant to and ahead of what is being discussed in England. It still involves fundamental questions as to whether central government will fund and manage such a service and the extent to which care sector workers shall have a living wage. My lady, the overall context suggests that prior to the pandemic, Scotland had greater poverty and ill health challenges than England, but was more resilient in its recognition of health inequalities and human rights, and with better engagement between government and people than presently valued or provided for by the UK government in England. And yet, the Scottish Government of COVID-19 often frustrated and harmed disabled people despite expressed commitment to do otherwise. The pandemic has therefore tested the validity of devolution both ways. It shows that Scotland does not have a fully determining government. However, as regards matters within its powers, Scottish Government does not always discharge the responsibilities that it wants to be judged by. Blaming UK government for all shortcomings abdicates the power that Scottish Government enjoys. Generally, good policy statements must align with better practice and outcomes, including at the point of local delivery to enable independent living and equal participative citizenship. It is not enough to tender to vulnerability. There must be well-being. Otherwise, devolved government will delude itself as to its difference, and the inequities of the pandemic and its countermeasures will repeat in future crises. Insofar as broader change is required, the DPO commend to both Scotland and the UK the proposals of the Scottish Social Renewal Advisory Board. It would incorporate key international human rights instruments into domestic law, take action to realise the human rights of disabled people, build inclusive communication into all levels of government, and commit to co-design and deeper engagement with those people in communities who have first-hand experience of poverty, inequality, and restricted life chances. The imperative for these changes is summed up in the title of the report, which again can be commended to this inquiry. The title is, If Not Now, When? My lady, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Freedman. I think we can fit you in, Mr. Jacobs, just before we break.
Thank you, my lady. I'll carry through to the end unless I'm wanted to pause at any point for the break.
Carry on if you can, please.
This is the joint opening statement of the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, and the Scottish Trade Union Congress, the STUC. The TUC and the STUC are separate organisations, but with shared aims and values. The 54 unions affiliated to the TUC represent over 5 million working people across a range of sectors across the four corners of the UK. The STUC is a national lobbying, campaigning and coordinating body for trade unions for Scotland and represents over 545,000 trade union members. Both the TUC and STUC aim to provide a voice for working people and to shine a light on the consequences of decision-making for the experiences of those at work. Tomorrow, the inquiry is to hear evidence from Ros Foyer, General Secretary of the STUC. This opening submission will highlight the loss and sacrifice of those in the workplace in Scotland and focus on the approach to decision-making within central government. From the union perspective, that decision-making was one which no doubt had its deficiencies, but was in Scotland nonetheless underpinned by a process of meaningful consultation and partnership, which was welcome. Inevitably, it is impossible not to frame the Scottish perspective, and no doubt that of Wales and Northern Ireland in due course, as a counterpoint to that of Westminster. It is an illuminating counterpoint. Module 2 has heard evidence of shocking dysfunction in the UK government response, with decision makers repeatedly oscillating between the pursuit of varying objectives against a background of bitter squabbling resembling something of a playground politics. The decision making in respect of Scotland is yet to be explored in these oral hearings, but the indications thus far, we suggest, are of a more professional, mature and open form of decision-making within Scottish Government. As with our opening submissions in modules 1 and 2 of this inquiry, we begin, however, by acknowledging the loss and sacrifice during the pandemic in the workplace. On this occasion, of course, in the particular context of the Scottish workplace. We also acknowledge the power and tragedy of the human stories told in the Impact film this morning, and we acknowledge that they are stories of a kind replicated by so many others across Scotland. We have provided to the inquiry a paper by the Scottish Centre for Administrative Data Research. It describes that in Scotland, men working in essential elementary service occupations such as kitchen assistants and waiters, along with large good vehicles drivers and taxi drivers, had exceptionally high mortality rates. Among women in Scotland, higher rates were also observed in elementary occupations, including industrial cleaning operations, packers, bottlers and canners. Higher mortality rates were also observed among female workers employed as process plant and machine operatives, such as those in food, drink and textile industries, assemblers and sewing machinists, postal workers, couriers and shelf fillers. The differences in mortality rates between sectors reflects both occupational risk and the social class gradient in health outcomes. That, of course, is consistent with the evidence of Professors Marmot and Bamburgh in modules 1 and 2, some of which was summarised this morning by Mr. Dawson. It all points to one of the profound consequences of the pandemic, that those who were generally less well off, with greater disadvantage and vulnerability, paid the greater price. It was true of Scotland as it was across the UK. It was the price paid by people who kept parcels being delivered to our doors, who transported key workers to work, who processed our food, who stacked our shelves, who cared for our sick and elderly, and many others. We touch, my lady, on 2 points of context, upon which we do not focus in our written or oral submissions, but we wish to acknowledge their importance. The first is that of pandemic preparedness, or rather, lack of it. The state of preparedness in Scotland is already being examined in Module 1, as Mr. Dawson has explained. The evidence heard by this inquiry indicates that the deficiencies in preparedness were shared across Westminster and the devolved administrations. Whatever the merits of Scottish decision-making, the outcomes were ultimately limited by a lack of preparedness. Given the misplaced confidence that the UK was prepared, it was not just a standing start at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a standing start facing in the wrong direction. We certainly wish the members of the TUC and STUC affiliated unions to understand that this crucial issue of pandemic unpreparedness is already under careful consideration by this inquiry, including in relation to Scotland, albeit in a different module. The second point of context is that of austerity. The inquiry has received bountiful evidence, primarily in Module 1, as to the resilience of public services going into the pandemic, and therefore, inevitably, as to the legacy of austerity. Just as the achievable outcomes in Scotland were limited by pandemic preparedness, they were also limited by public services having been hollowed out over the preceding decade. These two features loom large over the decision-making with which this module is centrally concerned. We turn to the issue of government consultation and partnership with unions. As Ros Foyer explains as General Secretary of the STUC, the organisation has had a successful history of engagement and working with the government in Scotland, both through established formal and informal processes. It is characteristic, we would suggest, of a more open culture generally within Scottish Government that includes working constructively and meaningfully with external partners, whether they be unions, businesses, academics, children's commissioners, and many others. This consultative approach generally managed to subsist throughout the pandemic. It was framed at the outset in a joint statement by the Scottish Government and the STUC titled Fair Work During the COVID-19 Crisis. It described an approach where workers, trade unions and employers work together constructively to reach the right decisions on all workplace issues that arise throughout the crisis. The structures used for that working together, both pre-existing and implemented by way of response to the pandemic, are described both in the STUC's evidence and in that of Scottish Government witnesses. Fiona Hislop, then Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, proactively contacted the STUC in March 2020 to seek its support in pandemic response, and a regular format for meetings was established. The consultation was important, not least as the STUC was uniquely placed to gather information, identify concerns, and offer advice further to its representative structure, covering all parts of the voluntary and public sector in Scotland. That structure enables direct reporting and feedback from key workers who are delivering emergency and essential services. To put it in the context of the workplace impact we have described, it should give the government a line of sight on the practical issues facing those high-risk, high-vulnerability occupations in which mortality was high. However, it is not just that a line of communication existed. To some extent, lines of communications to stakeholders existed in Westminster. What is more fundamental is whether the communication is meaningful, whether it is placatory or open to challenge, whether it is dismissive or interested. As this inquiry has heard in an earlier module, the Westminster and Number 10 approach was best described by the less favourable of those adjectives. It is encapsulated by the note of Boris Johnson describing in a meeting with senior ministers that he, quote, can't have the bollocks of consulting with employees and trade unions, unquote. In our lengthier written submissions, we set out some of the detail on the way in which this consultation fed into and enhanced a number of areas of decision-making. One of the striking examples is in relation to government policy on face coverings. The Scottish Government, urged by unions, generally succeeded in adopting a precautionary approach and advocating or requiring the use of face coverings, given the potential benefits and limited costs of doing so. In contrast, the UK government lagged behind, and the evidence in Module 2 revealed that it did so by taking an oppositional approach to unions. Reference was made in internal communications to Boris Johnson backing a no surrender to unions approach, which he totally regrets later. It was antithetical to precautionary, mature and open decision-making, and in contrast to the decision-making in Scotland. Another example is the adequacy of financial support for low-income workers required to self-isolate and the inadequacy of statutory sick pay. The evidence considered in Module 2 revealed that the UK government was being urged from all sides to increase the support for self-isolation, particularly financial support. That included not just calls from unions, but from UK Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Advisor, from SPI-B, from the behavioural scientists, from the Department of Health and Social Care, from regional mayors and others. The evidence in this module indicates that the Scottish Government, having listened to unions, was another voice urging the UK Government to adopt a different approach. That is not to say, of course, that there were not shortcomings. There were many examples of the STUC being given little to no time to respond adequately to complex documents or to ensure that representatives with the right level of expertise about a sector were present for meaningful dialogue. The STUC often found itself inadequately resourced for the engagement that was being sought by the Scottish Government. There are lessons to be learned about the need for Scottish Government when engaging with stakeholders to ensure that the organisations are given the assistance they need to develop the capacity and infrastructure to contribute to decisions meaningfully and at pace. There were also many occasions where the STUC raised serious concerns with Scottish Government ministers about decisions that, in the STUC's view, had lacked appropriate consultation. My lady, it is, however, in the nature of decision-making that aspires to be the product of meaningful consultation, that what is achieved is progress towards that aspiration rather than perfection. Next, we address the differences in culture between Scottish Government and Westminster. We set out in our written submissions in more detail some of the differences which appear to us to be apparent. For example, the Scottish Government appears to have been quicker to work within clear and agreed frameworks for decision-making. The inquiry can consider whether Westminster's careering between different objectives was a feature of the characters in power, the Prime Minister who was widely referred to internally as the trolley, or whether it may have been assisted by the frameworks for decision-making more readily used in Scotland. Some of the evidence suggests that the meetings of the Scottish Cabinet appear to have been, in substance, decision-making meetings where various members of Cabinet contributed before First Minister exercised final sign-off. The use of formal decision-making in Scottish Government forums contrasts with the ever-diminishing circle of decision-makers that appears to have taken hold in Number 10, often meeting informally and guided by the belief that the intellect of a very small few will come good. There also appears to have been an important basic professionalism that was lacking in parts of Number 10 and Westminster more generally. Nicola Sturgeon describes that the working environment within Scottish Government during the pandemic was professional, serious and formal, and titles such as First Minister, Deputy First Minister, Cabinet Secretary would be used in meetings. At the same time in Westminster, a male-dominated group of ministers were urging each other to, quote, back the Gavster, unquote, a reference to Sir Gavin Williamson, were laughing about Hancockian timetables, a reference to Mr. Hancock, and other examples which must be thousands in number. In examining decision-making in central government, the inquiry will no doubt look carefully at the extent to which decision-making was influenced by the cultures that existed within UK and devolved governments. Finally, we touch briefly on collaboration between Scottish and Westminster governments and divergence. Primarily, we urge caution in considering the narrative suggested by some that the Scottish Government sought difference for difference's sake. On analysis, differences appear to have been in appropriate pursuit of public health objectives. It is difficult to see, for example, what criticism could be levelled at the Scottish Government for diverging from the UK approach on the 12th of March 2020 in banning gatherings of over 500 people, or for taking a more precautionary approach in respect of the use of face masks. My lady, it would be surprising if in a future pandemic, either nation adopts an approach that is reluctant to issue guidance on face masks or to ban mass gatherings when hospitals are on the precipice of being overwhelmed. In fact, as the Scottish Government announced on the 12th of March the banning of large events, in England the Cheltenham Festival was in full flow. That doesn't stand as a symbol of Scottish divergence. It stands as a monument of deficiencies in UK government decision-making. Divergence may also reflect limitations in cooperation. The devolved administrations were not routinely included in COVID-O and COVID-S meetings. Many in Scottish Government described the perception that the government did not work together to make decisions, and the UK Government generally made decisions unilaterally. That perception dovetails with the evidence heard by this inquiry that, for example, Mr. Johnson did not want to meet with the leaders of the devolved nations for fear of it appearing to be a mini-EU, and such meetings being, such was his view, constitutionally a bit weird. It is also evident that the divergence in approach between administrations worked both ways. The UK government equally diverged from the wishes of the Scottish government. It points to the force of an observation by Ken Thompson, who dismisses any implicit understanding that Westminster's approach was orthodox, from which other parts of the UK diverged. We conclude, my lady, with this observation. To some witnesses in Module 2, the deeply unattractive side of the internal dysfunction within the UK government was just Westminster. Correct or otherwise, it cannot be said to be just politics. As the evidence in Module 2A demonstrates, a more mature, professional and open form of central government is achievable. It is submitted that the evidence in this module demonstrates the value of a form of government that is open to and meaningfully engages with the views of stakeholders, including trade unions. It is an approach of consultation and engagement which should be embraced and strengthened in a future pandemic. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Jacobs. Right, we'll break now and I shall return at 20 past. Rory Phillips, King's Counsel.
Ladies, you know I appear on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council,
Yes.
which is a national coordinating body representing UK police forces. And as again you know, the NPCC was a core participant in modules 1 and 2, and it's worked to assist the inquiry at every stage of the proceedings. Now, in this module, the NPCC represents the interests of the Police Service of Scotland, often referred to as Police Scotland. And the police in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, were one of the frontline organisations when it came to the management of the pandemic. Now, my lady, in Module 2, you heard evidence from Martin Hewitt, who was the chair of the organisation throughout the pandemic. In this module, you won't hear from any police witnesses. However, you do have a written statement from Temporary Deputy Chief Constable Annan Spears, who led the policing response to the pandemic in Scotland. Now, Police Scotland established a formal response to the pandemic at a very early stage, with the setting up of Operation Tala in January 2020. Of course, the policing scope of this module extends only to the issue of the enforcement of the COVID-19 regulations. But as you heard in Module 2, and as you'll see again from the written statement I've mentioned, Operation Tala coordinated a far broader range of work over the course of the pandemic. Its portfolios included the critical task of maintaining core policing functions, supporting the criminal justice system, establishing procedures for the collation and analysis of COVID-19 data, and finally, procuring, delivering, and training staff in the use of PPE. But so far as enforcement is concerned, again, you've already heard evidence about the central importance of the NPCC's 4 E's guidance: engage, explain, encourage, enforce. Its importance to policing in England and Wales, and that holds equally true for policing in Scotland, which adopted the same guidance in March 2020. Throughout the pandemic, the constant messaging both within Police Scotland and by Police Scotland to the public was that enforcement was the last resort, to be used only when the first 3 E's had been exhausted. In Module 2, you may remember Martin Hewitt explained that for police officers engaging with the public on these restrictions, it was compliance and not enforcement which was the measure of success. As he said, in a public health context, it's compliance which prevents transmission and keeps the community and indeed the police safe. Lady, in my closing submissions for Module 2, I made the point to you that when it comes to the enforcement of the COVID regulations, the police response cannot fairly be assessed solely by reference to the number of FPNs issued, because that omits all the encounters which successfully achieved compliance. And I noted then that the overwhelming majority of police engagements began and ended with those first 3 E's. In Module 2A, that submission is reinforced by the data published and produced by Police Scotland. Because recognising the critical importance of gathering and analysing data to track the progress of the pandemic, in April 2020, Police Scotland created a bespoke computer system called CVI to record every COVID-related encounter between the police and members of the public. And the data that was collated on that system was published on a weekly basis and was then analysed in a series of independent reports by Professor Susan McVie from the University of Edinburgh in order to ensure transparency and accountability. And that data shows that approximately 88% of all encounters were able to be resolved by officers using one or more of those first 3 E's without any need to progress to enforcement. And so in this context, where the measure of success is achieving public compliance with the regulations to prevent transmission, the data shows, I would suggest, that the 4 E's guidance was effective. Lady, it was a priority for Police Scotland to ensure that, in the small proportion of cases which resulted in enforcement, officers were acting appropriately and within the scope of the powers granted to them under the novel and evolving public health regulations. So to that end, Police Scotland established the Independent Advisory Group on the police use of temporary powers to provide oversight and also assurance. The IAG, as the group became known, met regularly between April 20 and May 22, and its purpose was to help the police to ensure that the powers conferred on them by these new regulations were exercised appropriately, lawfully, and in compliance with human rights legislation. The IAG was wholly independent, was led by a respected King's Counsel, and it reported publicly and directly to the Scottish Police Authority. In addition, Police Scotland undertook an extensive lesson learning exercise during the pandemic in order to identify positive practices and ensure they were implemented for the future. And that exercise resulted in the production of an operational scoping report and, following the pandemic, a debrief project. And the result of both those work streams have been disclosed to the inquiry in the hope that they'll assist you on the question of policing the pandemic in Scotland. Lady, one of the key lessons identified by that process is the immense benefit which was derived from collaborative working with third sector organisations and with representatives of vulnerable groups. It was clear from an early stage that the virus and the lockdown had the potential to cause real harm to persons with vulnerabilities, to children, to minority groups, and to victims of abuse. And so the dedicated liaison, which was undertaken by Police Scotland during the pandemic, as described in TDCC's Spears witness statement, helped to ensure that issues could be better identified and then addressed, that guidance produced in response was appropriate, and the policing actions were informed by those most affected. Lady, of course, I understand that you have a vast amount of ground to cover in a relatively brief hearing. And I also acknowledge, as I did at the outset, that the question of enforcement is but a single sub-issue in your long list of issues. I think it merited a single sentence in your council's lengthy opening earlier. And so it's right that the role of the NPCC in this hearing is necessarily limited. Nonetheless, the NPCC will seek to assist you in your work and provide insight into the pandemic from that policing perspective. And for example, Police Scotland worked closely with the Scottish Government throughout the pandemic. Again, you have the written evidence on this, but in short, for Police Scotland, this was a collaborative and constructive relationship with both sides working towards the same goal, to prevent transmission and to keep the public safe. Lady, it's hard to overstate just how challenging the circumstances of the pandemic were, both for those on the front lines of policing who put their lives at risk, and for senior officers who worked round the clock to adapt to new regulations and the evolving virus. My suggestion to you, my lady, is that Police Scotland rose admirably to meet those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Phillips. Very grateful. Una Doherty, King's Counsel. Is it Doherty or Doherty? Doherty. Thank you. Sorry, I meant to check in the break and I forgot. Well, there's a green light on.
I've tried, that's it now.
That's it.
Thank you, Milady. I appear on behalf of NHS National Services Scotland, NHS NSS for short. NHS NSS welcomes this UK inquiry, which has been established to ascertain the UK's preparedness for and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of the pandemic across the 4 nations of the UK, and the lessons to be learned. At the outset, NHS NSS offers its condolences to all those bereaved as a result of COVID-19 and its sympathy to the wider public who suffered as a result of the far-ranging effects of the pandemic. NHS NSS is a core participant in a number of modules in this inquiry, including this module 2A. As a public body, NHS NSS understands the responsibility it owes to the inquiry and to the people of Scotland, and it will continue to support the inquiry's work in any way it can. NHS NSS is conscious that, although the inquiry team is aware of the organisation NHS NSS, the wider public may not know what it is, or does, or why it is a core participant in this module. This opening statement, therefore, contains a brief introduction first to the NHS in Scotland, and then to NHS NSS, explaining its roles and its interest in this module of the inquiry. The NHS in Scotland is and has always been separate from the NHS elsewhere in the UK. It was created in 1948 as a result of the National Health Service Scotland Act 1947. NHS Scotland consists of 14 territorial NHS boards, which are each responsible for the protection and improvement of health and the delivery of frontline healthcare services to the population within the particular board's geographical area. In addition, there are 6 national NHS boards: Healthcare Improvement Scotland, National Education Scotland, Scottish Ambulance Service, NHS 24, the State Hospital and Golden Jubilee National Hospital, and 1 public health body, Public Health Scotland, who all support the territorial NHS boards by providing a range of specialist and national services. The Scottish Government oversees the activities of the NHS in Scotland. It sets national outcomes and priorities for health and social care, approves plans with the territorial NHS boards and the national NHS boards, and manages the performance of the NHS boards. Turning now to NHS NSS, It is a non-departmental public body accountable to the Scottish Government. It was created in 1974 under secondary legislation derived from the National Health Service Scotland Act 1972. It was established to provide national strategic support services and expert advice to Scotland's NHS. Its headquarters are in Edinburgh, but it has staff based at a number of locations in Scotland. It is structured into several different units, each providing distinct services. Services currently provided by NHS NSS include those given by the following units: National Procurement and Logistics, Practitioner and Counter Fraud Services, Antimicrobial Resistance and Healthcare Associated Infection Scotland, Central Legal Office, Digital and Security Services, Health Facilities Scotland, National Specialist Services Directorate, Programme Management Service, Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, and NHS Scotland Assure. Prior to 1st April 2020, NHS NSS also provided a service called Health Protection Scotland. Elements of that service moved on 1st April 2020 to become part of a new organisation, Public Health Scotland. While within NHS NSS, Health Protection Scotland planned and delivered specialist national services aimed at protecting the people of Scotland from infectious and environmental harms. One part of Health Protection Scotland prior to 1st April 2020, the Antimicrobial Resistance and Healthcare Associated Infection Team, remained in NHS NSS and is now known as Antimicrobial Resistance and Health Associated Infection Scotland. Although it is not primarily a public-facing organisation, all services provided by NHS NSS have had a role in the response to the pandemic in Scotland. Its roles during the pandemic response included the following: programme management services to a range of programmes, including the commissioning and decommissioning of the Louisa Jordan Hospital, Test and Protect, and COVID-19 vaccination programmes. Leading the mobilisation of construction partners, included in contracting, design, construction and equipping of the Louisa Jordan Hospital, and providing technical oversight on mechanical, electrical and water systems at the Louisa Jordan facility. Development of therapeutic convalescent plasma treatments, procurement and logistics for personal protective equipment, procurement, development and operation of digital platforms for Test and Protect and COVID-19 vaccination and COVID-19 status certification programmes, including publicly accessible apps and web platforms, procurement and logistics for polymerase chain reaction PCR testing, including consumables, equipment and laboratories, procurement and logistics for lateral flow tests and point-of-care testing, including consumables and equipment. Commissioning and operation of the National Contact Centre, providing support to Test and Protect, COVID-19 vaccinations and COVID-19 status certification. Operational delivery of the UK national and local testing programmes in Scotland, working with the UK Health Security Agency, local authorities, health boards and the Scottish Ambulance Service to ensure access to appropriate COVID-19 testing for the population. Working with other bodies on the production of infection prevention and control guidance. NHS NSS therefore played a significant operational role in the response to the pandemic in Scotland. In this Module 2A, the inquiry focuses on Scotland, examining the core political and administrative decision-making by the Scottish Government in response to the pandemic. Health in Scotland is a matter devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Prior to devolution, the Secretary of State for Scotland had responsibility for health in Scotland. Given that health is a devolved matter, the Scottish Government, rather than the UK Government, was responsible for core decision-making on the response to the pandemic in the health sector in Scotland. As a public body supporting Scotland's NHS, NHS NSS is interested in this module's scrutiny of the Scottish Government's decision-making in relation to the health sector. It is particularly interested in the extent of cooperation between the four nations of the UK during the pandemic, specifically in relation to the sharing of relevant information and epidemiological data, so that the Scottish Government was as well informed as it could be when making decisions relevant to the health sector in Scotland. Thank you, Milady. That concludes the opening statement on behalf of NHS NSS.
Thank you very much indeed, and apologies for my coughing. Mr Bowie, King's Counsel. Is it Bowie or Barry? I need to check all these.
It's Bowie.
Barry, sorry.
Good afternoon, my lady. This is the opening statement on behalf of Public Health Scotland. My lady has, of course, heard of and indeed from Public Health Scotland, or PHS for short. For those who have not, it may assist if I start with some brief remarks about the organisation and the work that it does. PHS is Scotland's national public health body. It's a young organisation, having only become operational on 1st April 2020, near to the start of the pandemic, and it originated in a programme of public health reform in Scotland. Why was it created? The rationale for its creation was to establish a unified public health organisation with a focus on protecting and improving the health and well-being of Scotland's population and, no less importantly, reducing societal health inequalities. As Professor Paul Kearney stated in his report recently provided to this inquiry, PHS embodied Scottish Government's commitment and significant desire to address health inequalities nationally. The objective of the organisation has been said to provide a credible, independent voice based on evidence and professional judgment that can objectively assess and comment on the likely impact, benefits and risks to the public's health and well-being of policy proposals. How then, in practical terms, does it do that? It seeks to identify and understand what has been scientifically shown to improve and protect health and reduce inequality nationally. It then shares that knowledge with relevant persons and organisations. In carrying out its role, it collaborates extensively with the private, public and third sectors. In terms of who the organisation is accountable to, it's obviously accountable to Scottish Government, but it's also accountable to local government, reflecting the fact that public health requires action both nationally and locally. This dual accountability was a feature which at the time of PHS's creation was very well received within public health spheres and viewed as a progressive policy initiative on the part of Scottish Government. But ultimately, PHS is accountable to the people of Scotland. It works to protect and improve the health of Scotland's population, and therefore it acutely felt and continues to feel the terrible impact wrought by this pandemic. It's also perhaps equally important to give an idea of what the organisation does not do. For example, the organisation is not involved in many of the practical aspects of maintaining public health at a community or local level. Many of the steps to support the control of the pandemic at a local level were performed by public health teams within Scotland's 14 territorial health boards. Neither is PHS involved in regulation or inspection activities. Thus, it's a misconception held by some that during the pandemic, PHS was responsible for inspecting care homes. That was not the case. I now want to turn to the pandemic itself. During the pandemic, PHS had a major role leading and contributing to Scotland's response across a range of areas. Its scientific knowledge and expertise were relied upon by Scottish Government, and the organisation was widely viewed as a key source of data, information and advice. That message is reflected in a number of the Scottish Government witness statements prepared for this module, which my lady will have seen. In relation to particular areas involving public PHS working with or supporting Scottish Government, and which PHS considers were particularly successful, I'd refer briefly to 4 examples. First, on modelling, PHS supported Scottish Government's modelling of future projections of the pandemic through the provision of data and intelligence on case numbers. Second, on national testing, PHS advised the Scottish Government on the development of its national testing strategy as part of the wider national COVID-19 response and led the development of a whole genome sequencing service for Scotland. Third, on the importance of maintaining low levels of community transmission of COVID-19 in Scotland, PHS advised Scottish Government on the development and rollout of its Test and Protect programme and played a major role in the delivery of the National Contact Tracing Service. And fourth, In the digital medium, PHS shaped the digital infrastructure that supported the response. This included creation of the PHS dashboard and publication of weekly and other statistical reports. I'll say something more about this later in this opening statement. There are 3 points worth highlighting. First, although COVID-19 has taken up a large amount of the organisation's time and resources since its inception in April 2020, its areas of work go significantly beyond COVID-19. Its work involves a broad range of public health matters. Second, in coming into existence at the start of the pandemic, PHS faced twin challenges. It went through an inevitable bedding in process associated with establishing itself as a new organisation. There were organisational issues to be addressed, but compounded by the pandemic and its effects, which were overlaid on top. Of course, at the same time, the organisation also had the responsibility of being the lead public health body in Scotland's national pandemic response. In the early days of the pandemic, the organisation faced a number of issues relating to this bedding-in period, including challenges around staff, information systems, governance, and creating a new cohesive organisational culture from the 3 legacy bodies. Moreover, PHS's opening budget and staffing levels were not sufficient for PHS to deliver the health protection response required by the pandemic. Additional funding was helpfully provided by Scottish Government, but for a period there was a shortage of personnel within PHS trained and experienced in pandemic response. Although PHS considers that at an organisational level it nevertheless responded well during that period, this was not without a cost. It recognises and acknowledges that this would not have been possible without the enormous dedication of its staff and their willingness to work long hours over sustained periods. That, combined with stressful working conditions, without a doubt, adversely impacted on staff health and well-being, as indeed was the case throughout many parts of the NHS, local government and beyond. And third, at that time, a significant proportion of the organisation's expertise in relation to pandemic matters was held by a small group of individuals within the organisation upon whom significant demands were placed throughout the pandemic. This fact underscores the need for the organisation to have been more resilient, a point highlighted in the PHS Lessons Learned report, which has been produced to the inquiry. I now want to make some more specific comments in relation to 3 topics. First, PHS's role in supporting Scottish Government in decision-making. Second, data. And third, guidance. So turning to the first of these, PHS's role in supporting Scottish Government in decision-making. First, PHS's role was to support Scottish Government in its decision-making. The organisation's role was not to take those decisions, nor did it decide the policy upon which they were based. The key policies which underpinned the Scottish Government's approach to the management of the pandemic were chosen by and the responsibility of Scottish Government. This was clearly correct and respected the lines of responsibility between adviser and the Scottish ministers as the ultimate decision makers. Second, PHS gave Scottish Government scientific advice, and uniformly it sought to do so on the basis of the best available data and evidence. During the height of the pandemic, PHS staff spoke regularly to Scottish Government colleagues, providing public health perspectives on issues as well as expertise. However, as the pandemic progressed, there were times it was required to give advice at very short notice. This inevitably proved particularly challenging for the organisation. And third, in taking decisions, Scottish Government applied a decision-making framework which became known as the 4 harms approach. The concept recognised that both the pandemic itself and measures taken in response to it could separately cause harm. Moreover, the harm caused was not all of the same type, but rather could be categorised into 4 broad groups: direct health harms caused by COVID, broader health harms, social harms, and economic harms. the judgments and decisions made by Scottish Government around the four harms were often complex, involving a difficult balancing exercise. Given the varied nature of the harms, Scottish Government often required to consider a wide range of evidence and expertise to enable it to take informed decisions. This included input from local and national health boards, executive agencies, non-departmental public bodies, civil society and academia. It's noteworthy that PHS's expertise was in public health, and as such, its advice focused on direct and indirect health harms, i.e. harms 1 and 2, and particularly harm 1. In consequence, there were quite properly occasions when PHS's advice, being based on a more limited perspective than that of Scottish Government, was not accepted by Scottish Government. The phrase "following the science" is one that has been used in this context, and it's worth saying that this phrase is not entirely helpful because at best it oversimplifies the decision-making process. All of that said, PHS's overwhelming experience of this process was that the Scottish Government considered the contributions it made with care and respect. The second topic I wish to turn to now is data. The use of data was particularly important in the response to the pandemic, and a number of initiatives proved very effective. Indeed, PHS was the primary source for data and intelligence on the pandemic. Daily figures were produced on the number of tests conducted, the number of confirmed cases, the test positivity rate, and mortality figures. Public reporting took place 7 days a week, 365 days a year on both the PHS and Scottish Government websites. There are 3 initiatives which PHS considers were very successful and worthy of note. First, PHS developed a range of effective data and analytic outputs that included robust estimates of the number of people with COVID-19 in Scotland, hospitalisations and deaths. Where possible, deprivation and ethnicity data with information relating to underlying health conditions were provided. The information was widely shared within UK organisations such as SAGE and the New and Emerging Respiratory Virus Threats Advisory Group, or NERVTAG, bodies with which we are now very familiar in this inquiry, but also with international agencies including WHO, the European Centre for Prevention, Disease and Control, or ECDC, and the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, in the US. The sharing of information and data with international colleagues was invaluable and allowed assumptions to be tested whilst additionally giving early insights into new findings. Second, the PHS Daily Dashboard was considered by many to be a very valuable tool. The platform allowed the public, local authorities and Scottish Government to gain immediate access to COVID-19 data in an accessible, easy-to-use format that promoted understanding of the relevant information. As a testament to its success, it was accessed more than 50 million times during the pandemic. Such data visualisation was crucial in relation to Scottish Government's communication with and subsequent engagement by the public. The dashboard was publicly available, updated daily and often referred to in Scottish Government press releases and media appearances. It also improved over time as more data became available. And third, PHS worked with Edinburgh University to restart a data reporting system, the Early Pandemic Evaluation and Enhanced Surveillance, or EVE project. It had been used in the swine flu pandemic of 2009, but had been in hibernation since then. The project was renamed EVE2 and went on to gather vital intelligence about issues such as the spread of the disease, impact on health, and critically, vaccine effectiveness. The project received international attention when it published one of the first evaluations into the effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccinations. EVE2 findings showed that Oxford AstraZeneca and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines reduced the number of people being hospitalised with COVID. Randomised controlled trials had already shown the vaccines were safe and effective, but EVE2 provided the first evidence that it had an effect at a national level. Scotland's size and data infrastructure, plus the speed of the rollout of the vaccination programme, meant that the EVE2 consortium was the first in the world to be able to publish such findings. The pandemic also highlighted data-related areas where PHS considers that there was and is room for improvement. First, in relation to data collection, the current system is built on a suite of older technologies and could be significantly improved to increase resilience. For example, the ACOS, Electronic Communication of Surveillance in Scotland system, was critical during the pandemic, but was prone to failure due to the volume and speed of transactions. Second, the sharing of data across organisations was not straightforward because of variance in systems used. Routine sharing of data with and by trusted NHS authorities under updated information governance arrangements are essential. Progress was made during the pandemic, but there is a risk that it may slip back. Third, the sharing of data between the 4 nations of the UK to support the management of incidents was challenging and continues to be. And finally, but no less importantly, access to reliable, timely data was not available from care homes. Having up-to-date intelligence on care home residents would have allowed linkage of laboratory data to care home residents, enabled quicker understanding of care home outbreaks, and supported an effective response. The final topic, my lady, is that of guidance. PHS was responsible for producing certain health protection guidance during the pandemic. The guidance had the important function of informing what action was necessary to combat COVID-19 infection and contained elements directed both to health protection and infection protection and control. However, the guidance served a further purpose. Its other important function was to operationalise Scottish Government policy. In practical terms, to ensure the latter, during the pandemic, PHS and Scottish Government agreed a process which was known as the Policy Alignment Check process, or PAC for short. Although well-intentioned, it's fair to say that there were challenges associated with it. The PAC process introduced an additional layer into the existing process of developing and issuing guidance upon which frontline teams and services relied. Under it, the final sign-off guidance was by Scottish Government rather than by Public Health Scotland. At times, the process was slow, resulting in delays such that the guidance was not always produced timeously. On occasion, the guidance became out of date and the process needed to be started again. These issues came to light particularly in the context of care home guidance. The PAC process was a direct consequence of the NHS in Scotland having been placed on an emergency footing during the period from March 2020 to April 2022. PHS does not call into question the necessity for imposing emergency powers given the exceptional circumstances. Indeed, that was a political decision and one entirely for Scottish Government to make. However, it's important to recognise and acknowledge that in consequence, there was an impact on PHS's independent voice for public health. For present purposes, PHS would observe that having an independent voice is vital to its role of protecting the public's health. PHS is grateful to you, my lady, for the opportunity to make this opening statement. We will endeavour to be of whatever assistance we can to you and your team over the weeks to come. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr Barry. Geoffrey Mitchell, KC. Mr Mitchell.
Thank you very much, my lady. This is the opening statement on behalf of the Scottish Government. I appear today along with Junior Counsel Jennifer Nicholson-White and Kenneth Young, and we are instructed by Caroline Beattie of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. We wish to begin our statement by acknowledging the suffering of the thousands of families who have lost a loved one due to COVID-19. This is a loss that we know is felt to this very day. On behalf of the Scottish Government, we would like once again to give our condolences and sympathies to all of those who have been bereaved by COVID-19. The Scottish Government appreciates that legitimate questions arise as to the strategic decisions made during the pandemic and the way in which they were made.
Of course, it is relevant to bear in mind the context. Firstly, COVID-19 posed an unprecedented systemic threat to global health, to healthcare systems, economic activity and wider society. Secondly, it was the Scottish Government's responsibility to address that threat posed to the people of Scotland. The complexity of the systemic challenge created by the rapid spread and evolution of the virus, together with the whole of society aspect, meant that there was no single, simple and certain way to respond. The Scottish Government's strategic aim was to minimise the overall harm of the pandemic. Thirdly, the Scottish Government acknowledges that certain decisions could have been taken differently. Whether alternative options were practicably and realistically open to it, and whether they would have made a material difference, are separate questions and will no doubt be explored in evidence. Finally, it need hardly be said that all decisions taken by the Scottish Government during the pandemic, irrespective of certain consequential and deeply regrettable harmful effects, were taken with the aim of the protection of the people of Scotland as the core guiding principle. That is, to minimise the harm created and to reduce the loss of life. With those brief introductory remarks, I now turn to the 6 areas in which I would wish to make comment, and we deal with these in far greater detail in our written opening statement. The first is the period January to March 2020. By late January, early February, the Scottish Government was well aware that it was facing an increasingly serious situation. By early March, all of the UK governments were engaged in an intense analysis of early data on COVID and its impacts. On 12th March, the response in Scotland and throughout the UK moved from contained to delay as, for the first time, community transmission had been confirmed as occurring. Events moved at a fast pace, with measures and guidance introduced following scientific advice directed at, amongst other things, self-isolation, mass gatherings of 500 people or more, the closure of schools and nurseries, as well as certain businesses, and the minimisation of social contact. On 17th March, as we have heard, NHS Scotland was placed on an emergency footing. Significant work was done to ensure that the health service in Scotland was ready to deal with the modelled high numbers of people requiring hospital treatment. A large amount of guidance was issued to the social care sector. Work was done to ensure supplies of PPE were available, as well as reliable distribution routes. At this point, we would like to pause and to acknowledge, on behalf of the Scottish Government, the severe impact of the pandemic on the social care sector. Deaths that occurred in care homes and that were attributable to COVID-19 accounted for a significant percentage of all COVID-19 deaths in Scotland. Restrictions on visiting caused unintended pain and suffering. Residents, their relatives and care home staff all suffered. The Scottish Government acknowledges this. Evidence on this issue will surely and understandably figure in this and future modules. On 23rd March, the decision was made to impose a package of measures that came to be known as a lockdown, based on the clinical and scientific advice from SAGE and the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland. The judgment was made that additional measures had to be taken to suppress the spread of the virus in order to avoid significant health harm and the overwhelming of the NHS. The Scottish Government was fully aware that a lockdown would have far-reaching consequences, but it was judged that the threat to human health was of such significance that the strategy had to be pursued. The lockdown was highly effective in reducing community transmission and the level of infection, serious illness and death within the UK. Of course, it was not without consequential effects on health, including mental health, loneliness and isolation and levels of domestic abuse. With the benefit of hindsight, possessed with current knowledge as to the nature and effects of the virus, the Scottish Government would have wanted to impose a lockdown earlier. As stated, that is with the benefit of hindsight. That desire apart, practicable barriers would have stood in the way of that decision, such as the need for the UK Government to provide the necessary and consequent financial resources, for example, through schemes such as furlough. The second issue I would like to look at is leadership, the underpinning structures and decision-making. Core decisions regarding the handling of the pandemic in Scotland were undertaken by Scottish ministers. Within the Scottish Government, a high degree of formality surrounds decision-making. Even during the necessarily intense and rapid framing of its response to the pandemic, it sought to maintain the discipline of formal collective decision-making. Then, as now, ministers sought to be open, transparent and accountable in respect of the decisions made. Decisions were made by Cabinet or by ministers with appropriate delegated authority and were subject to the scrutiny of the Scottish Parliament. Some decisions were delegated by Cabinet to the First Minister. Formal records of decisions were kept, and decisions were communicated to the Scottish Parliament in oral and written statements, in the answering of parliamentary questions, and in the participation of ministers in meetings of the Parliament and of committees. Ministers received comprehensive briefing on the course of the pandemic, drawing on material from medical and scientific sources such as SAGE and the newly established Scottish COVID-19 Advisory Group. Advice was presented by clinical advisors within the Scottish Government and bodies such as Public Health Scotland. During the pandemic, careful note was kept both of the decisions made and of the supporting reasoning, information and advice and evidence. As required by statute, since 2013, the Scottish Government has had robust policies, plans and strategies regarding the management of records that are designed to ensure that there is a complete record of the business undertaken. The information that constitutes the record may take different forms or may be created in different ways. Regardless, the responsibility remains to ensure that such information becomes part of the record. In practice, this involves the transfer of information into one single location, the Scottish Government's corporate electronic document and records management system. In summary, the Scottish Government's structures and systems that were in place throughout the pandemic were clear, logical and transparent. It is submitted that it resulted in governance and leadership that was both effective and efficient. The third area I wish to look at is Scottish Government strategies and decisions during the pandemic. It became clear that the Scottish Government's response to COVID-19 would require a huge number of decisions to be made by ministers across government, at pace and sometimes at short notice, with some decisions being taken by a more focused group of key decision makers. The Framework for Decision-Making, published in April 2020, set out the Scottish Government's principles and approach, as well as its strategic objective, to contain and suppress the virus so as to minimise overall harm. It could do, taking into consideration the available scientific, clinical and public health advice. A key part of the approach was the concept of 4 harms, of which we have heard already today. Broadly speaking, the pandemic and measures in response to it could cause harm in 4 areas, namely harm 1, direct COVID health harms, that is, primarily the mortality and morbidity associated with contracting the disease. Harm 2, broader health harms, primarily the impact on the effective operation of the NHS and social care services. Harm 3, social harms, that is the harms to a wider society, for example, harm to education attainment as a result of school closures. Harm 4, economic harms, that is harms to the wider economy. The complexity of the systemic challenge posed by the rapid spread and evolution of COVID-19 meant that there was no single or individual correct response, and few, if any, harm-free decisions open to governments, including the Scottish Government. The challenge was to assess risks and benefits and take decisions to reduce overall harm as much as possible. The Scottish Government recognised that the 4 harms did not impact on everyone in society equally. Accordingly, inequalities were seen as a factor integral to the 4 harms. This approach was consistent with the aspirations of the Scottish Government, both before and after the pandemic, to build equality into policy making across all areas of government. It is also cognizant of its duties under equalities legislation and the need for all decision-making to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. Thus, equality impact assessments were used and published frequently during the pandemic. A great deal of work was done in this area. However, the Scottish Government does recognise that one of the key questions arising from the pandemic is if, how, and to what extent vulnerable and at-risk groups could have been better protected. In broad summary, as both the nature of the crisis changed and the Scottish Government's overall strategy evolved in response, so too did its approach to imposing and easing non-pharmaceutical interventions. From the initial lockdown of March 2020 through to the lifting of the remaining legal measures on 18th April 2022, all steps were guided by consideration of the four harms. Thus, in 2020 and the first half of 2021, the priority was to suppress the prevalence of the virus, even in recognition that such an approach might cause broader harms. May 2020 saw the publication of COVID-19, Scotland's route map through and out of the crisis, which detailed 4 phases of exiting lockdown. The Scottish Government took a precautionary approach to the relaxation of the restrictions, conscious of the fragile position in relation to the suppression of the virus, which would affect its ability to protect population health. During September and early October 2020, a great deal of work was done to repress a resurgent virus. The focus was, insofar as possible, to manage, stabilise and reduce the transmission of the virus through careful and targeted use of NPIs. In late October 2020, as the pandemic moved into a new phase requiring an enhanced NPI response, the Scottish Government published COVID-19 Strategic Framework. The strategic framework supported the overall approach, the overarching approach of taking decisions in the context of the four harms, but it gave the flexibility to put in place different measures in different parts of Scotland, if local and regional data supported that. This levels framework was designed differently from those that applied elsewhere in the UK, such as the tiers system in England. It was different both in terms of the NPIs included within each level, as well as the number of levels. The levels framework proved capable of responding to outbreaks and new variants without the need for a further national lockdown in Scotland. By defining measures in advance, the levels framework enabled the Scottish Government to communicate in advance what it would ask people to do and why. With the success of vaccines and the reduction in health risk to individuals, in particular older vaccinated individuals, the Scottish Government's strategic intent was adjusted. Ultimately, in February 2022, the strategic intent was revised for the last time in recognition that after 2 years of the pandemic and in light of developments in vaccines and treatments, a strategy that was overly focused on suppression of the virus would have a disproportionate impact on the other harms. The fourth area that I would like to look at is working with other governments and local authorities. Promoting and protecting the health of the Scottish people is a matter within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. Devolved control of the public health response by the Scottish Government was crucial to the effective handling of the pandemic in Scotland. At the same time, it was recognised during the response that there were areas in which it was vital to engage and work with the United Kingdom, Wales and Northern Ireland governments. Similarly, it was recognised from an early stage that effective working with Scotland's 32 local authorities would be vital in responding to the pandemic. Engaged participation with local authorities was forthcoming, for which the Scottish Government was deeply grateful. It is worth noting that current devolution arrangements reflect the will of the Scottish electorate. Quite properly, nothing was done to reallocate the existing roles and responsibilities of the Scottish Government for public health in response to the pandemic. Indeed, the close connection between the Scottish Government's responsibility for public health and those for healthcare, justice, policing, education, local government and most public services was central to the response. What did happen was that liaison between the Scottish and UK governments was intensified, with an enhanced level of engagement between Scottish Government Cabinet Secretaries, Ministers and officials and their counterparts in the UK, Wales and Northern Ireland governments. Cooperation with the UK Government was on the whole reasonably effective. However, this is not to say that there is no room for improvement. For example, on occasion, it appeared to the Scottish ministers that the UK Government treated certain fora as opportunities to inform the Scottish Government of decisions which had already been taken. This meant that meaningful discussion with the Scottish Government was sometimes absent in respect of UK government decisions that affected Scotland. There was no Scottish Government response to the pandemic which was guided by anything other than a desire to contain and suppress the virus in order to minimise the overall harm it could do. By working with the other governments of the United Kingdom, a commitment included within the framework for decision-making, Scotland was able to benefit from the best and most up-to-date expert scientific data and advice. This information helped to guide Scottish Government decisions which were always made to meet the specific circumstances in Scotland. Where the Scottish Government reached decisions that were different to those which were deemed appropriate in other parts of the United Kingdom, it did so after consideration of the facts and circumstances facing it. It is respectfully submitted that this reflects devolution working as it was intended. The result was decision-making that responded to local circumstances and that was accountable to a devolved legislature. The fifth and sixth areas that I wish to look at briefly, my lady, today are access to data and communication. They are substantive topics in and of themselves, and we deal with them in much greater depth in our written statement. Scottish data played an essential role in the pandemic. Although there were difficulties in the early days of the pandemic accessing the data, the Scottish Government established quickly the COVID-19 Modelling and Analysis Hub, which was able to share externally produced modelling evidence and research, as well as produce a range of its own data and modelling. This went into coordinating advice to ministers in respect of the 4 harms. The EVE2 study, of which we have just heard from Mr. Bowie for PHS, was a unique resource, created through a collaborative partnership between Public Health Scotland, Scottish universities and public health physicians. Using data from 5.4 million people registered with a GP in Scotland, the study successfully tracked the pandemic in near real time, as well as the effectiveness of the vaccines across Scotland. The research of EVE2 produced findings that had a global impact on the response to the pandemic. The final area is communication. In respect of communication with the public, one of the aims of the strategy was to provide a form of ongoing support via a regular presence to assist people through a worrying and distressing period. The strategy was designed to reach the population of Scotland as frequently as possible, with accessible information that could be easily understood and would motivate and prompt life-saving action by adopting protective behaviours. A variety of different communication channels, such as daily briefings by the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, helped to explain why levels of public confidence were consistently high. My lady, those are the 6 areas that I wish to look at today. They are explored in much greater detail in our written statement. But for now, I would close by saying that the Scottish Government is, of course, committed to learning and adapting as a result of the inquiry's findings. And it is grateful to the Chair for the opportunity to make today's submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mitchell. Right, that completes the submissions of the core participants and counsel to the inquiry. We've covered a great deal of material today in summary form, and I'm indebted to counsel to the inquiry and to all the core participants, legal representatives, for their submissions and for the focus which have enabled us to complete today's submissions in good time. So thank you all very much indeed. And tomorrow we shall sit at 10 o'clock and start hearing the evidence.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.